All right, everyone, welcome back to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I am excited to be joined by my colleague, Stacy McFeeters. Hi, Stacy.
Hi, Beth. How are you? Hi,
I'm
everyone.
good. So Stacy's a former financial aid officer at Emerson and Elm colleges. She also is a former vice president of student loans, education finance, student loans at JP Morgan Chase. She's the perfect person to talk to us today about loans. And the original topic today was just to talk about, okay, it's time to start getting ready to pay back your loans. But, COVID. And so maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the current kind of state of the student loan world as it relates to COVID, because COVID is having an impact.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously we're talking primarily about student loans, in many ways, primarily about federal student loans, which of course both students and parents can borrow. As most people probably know, especially those who have borrowed, as a part of the stimulus bill that came out in March, there were some provisions specific to student loans that allowed borrowers to take some time off and to have some interest-free time on their student loans. Originally, that was awarded through September, and in August, the provision was extended through the end of the year. So basically, what that means for anybody with federal student loans, you presently are not required to make payments. Any loans that you have that would be accruing interest are not, because they are set to zero. If you had been in collections for delinquency or forbearance, that has all been paused. And at the present moment, that is all in place through December 31st of this year. So the long and short of it is nobody is currently required to be making federal student loan payments. For those who have private student loans, different story. You may be having to make those payments at this point. Some lenders did award some forbearance type opportunities, but for federal loans, you are in a timeout period.
Got it. Although I would say, I know that with my stepson, we've suggested you should continue to pay,
Yeah.
right? So he
Yep.
graduated in May
Yep.
from grad school, had loans that were coming due. And our advice was, you have the means, you should continue to pay. Just because you can put off paying those, is it always a good idea to do that?
So, I mean, in many cases, it probably means that you're just putting off the inevitable. And so, what we have been telling families or borrowers since, since obviously this all began, is if you do have the ability to make any kind of payment, you absolutely should.
Right.
And why is that? Well, first of all, you're probably avoiding the inevitable, but you're also in a 0% interest period. So if you are making payments, you are paying your principal down. So the
Mm-hmm.
sooner you do that, the sooner you're done. That's sort of the whole name of the game.
Right.
So if you've had the opportunity to do that, do it. If you didn't know that that was a thing, you still have, a good 45-ish days. If you get a nice little windfall for the holidays, get a payment in before the end of the year, and that way you can start to pay down that principal.
And then is it your sense that it will just be done at the end of the year, or what's ahead of us? Should people be gearing up to start paying in January because they're going to have to,
Yeah.
or what's coming?
So,
If you
yeah,
could predict it, I will, kudos to you,
exactly,
because
exactly.
that's everyone's asking this question. What the
So
hell is coming?
the $1 million question, or $1.4 trillion question. So the reference there is that there's about $1.4 trillion in federal student loan debt outstanding right now. Actually, combined federal and private student loan debt. It's a lot of money. There's a lot of rumbling about something must be done. So, no, I don't have a crystal ball. However, I can tell you some of the things that we know are very much being talked about. Nothing is definite. There is for sure a lot of discussion about extending the provisions.
Mhm.
So, at a minimum, that's something everybody could keep an eye out for. And that would be to extend the existing provisions that we just talked about. Um, there's also a tremendous amount of discussion, obviously, in the political arena about some type of federal student loan forgiveness. That is one that I don't even want to jump on and guess. It feels like something might happen around that, but there's also a lot of opposition. And the opposition is obviously coming from a place of, but does that solve our problem?
Right.
Is that putting a band aid on a bullet wound, which is the expensive cost of college? It certainly could infuse some cash into into the economy by allowing, student loan borrowers to free up cash flow. So a lot of back and forth on that. So the reality is we do expect there will be some action after the first of the year, possibly after the inauguration around student loans. At this point, we don't know exactly what that would look like. So I can tell you we are really guiding people to start preparing to repay. Can certainly talk a little bit more about that, but wanted to see if you want to dive a little deeper into what we think might be.
Yeah, I mean, I saw an article that, that if when Biden comes in, that he could potentially, he has the executive power to forgive $50,000 worth of loans per person. Um, I'm mostly going to leave my personal feelings out about this, but I did read a really interesting article that someone else on our team shared that basically showed that really that is a huge sum of money, and that a lot of the people who would receive it really would be people who could afford to pay off their loans because they incurred those loans doing things like getting their MBA or becoming doctors or lawyers or majoring in something like my stepson, like accounting, where he is got his master's now and he's going to be a CPA, and I'm very proud of him. He's earned a great starting salary and that's really wonderful. But the reality is he doesn't need to have his loans forgiven.
Right.
If he was on the show right now, he might say, well, wait a second.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
get that too. I really do. And I understand the arguments on either side, but so there, I've completely shared my opinion on this, but I would prefer that if there was going to be loan forgiveness, it would go where it was most needed, right? To students maybe who didn't complete college and don't have the benefits that they were supposed to get from taking out that loans. And I think I saw in that article that the majority of those students, or the ones who are really coming from the underserved populations, have a lot less outstanding debt, but it is more crushing because of they don't have the jobs that really allow them to pay for it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
So that is one of the challenges. And that is, if there is to be forgiveness, what is the right way to do it? As you well know, and a lot of the folks listening well know, I've spent the better part of my career focusing with a lot of my attention on student loans. I have my own personal opinions as well. I do think that, yes, there is the opportunity, from what we understand, for an immediate executive order, which would obviously then supersede the need to go to Congress, where there will be a battle over this. Not sure that that will be enacted. There's a lot of reasons, but the reality is there are a lot of arguments to be made for, let's take the time to figure out the best way to do this for those who need it the most.
Right.
May or may not happen. So what I would say, in general, and I've heard from a lot of borrowers, they're like, I'm just holding out to see what happens.
Yes. I
Not
wonder
sure
about
that's a
that.
good idea. That could get you in trouble. So my best advice to folks in repayment, or who do have current student loans, you might want to think about getting prepared. The provisions end in January for returning borrowers who had been in repayment prior to the provisions. You're going to have a payment due in January, if not early February. Be prepared.
Mhm.
For those who graduated anytime sort of after the provisions went in March, actually, and it really could be December graduates as well. So remember, folks who graduated last December would have been in their grace period when the first provision was enacted. So in essence, anybody who graduated after last December probably hasn't had to make a student loan payment. For those who haven't, you should be keeping in touch with your servicers, because you also will be expected to make a payment. I know that some services are being super proactive, reaching out and saying, just remember, payments are going to start again. Pick the right payment option. For those who are in income-driven repayment programs, certify your income so your payment, matches what you make. By and large, I'd be prepared.
Yeah.
Something is probably going to happen, but if it doesn't, you don't want to be caught unaware and end up in a delinquency situation.
Right.
And you really don't want to ignore it to see if something good comes your way, because there's a lot of discussions about a lot of different things.
Right. And it may take quite a bit of time for that to come to anywhere. And as you point out, you don't want to wind up in delinquency in the meantime,
Exactly.
where you're just thinking, well, I don't need to worry about it yet. You took out the loans and now it's time to start thinking about it. And maybe
Exactly.
there will be something that comes along that helps out, but that doesn't mean you can't make some payments in the meantime.
Exactly.
Anything else that you would add on this front? Just things for families to think about as repayment comes near, just
Yep.
nuts and bolts related to this?
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about sort of what happens with federal student loans, and the reality is if there's going to be any kind of type of forgiveness, it by and large has to be around the federal programs. I could, I've been wrong in
Private
my
banks
life.
are not going to suddenly go, hey, you know what? We don't need
Yeah,
your money.
and the federal government is also not going to subsidize paying back private student loans. So
Right.
if you have those, you've got to be making sure you're thinking of that with a separate mindset. Those have to be paid. That's a debt to a bank or a lender of any kind. Same implications you would have if you blew off your mortgage or your car loan. So just make sure you're making those payments. But having worked in the industry, in the student loan arena for a very long time, student loans of all kinds are meant to be friendly debt.
Mhm.
So for those who, are crushed by their debt or, ignoring it, not your best bet. The
Mhm.
reality is you have to, be prepared to borrow, to pay back the loans that you've borrowed. Communicate with your servicers. Servicers are super, super willing to work with you. And unlike almost every other debt form out there are a lot of repayment options. You're going to be given one, which is your standard 120 payments, but there are a variety of other payment methods that will allow you to make smaller payments. So we hear a lot of folks saying, I just can't pay anything. I can't pay, so I'm not going to pay.
Right.
Whereas if you work with your servicer, they might start making, allowing you to make smaller payments at the beginning so you don't end up in a perilous credit situation.
Right. Exactly. And that's what you really want to avoid. And that's when things start to snowball and it becomes truly out of hand. And
Correct.
I think for those families who are listening who are in the process, so maybe you are a senior, maybe you have a junior, maybe you are a sophomore or a freshman, now is the time to get in your head that you should be looking to what is a realistic amount that you can pay so that maybe you are taking out a little bit in loans, but you're not taking out so much that it's crushing debt. Shannon and I just did a segment on the whole Harvard scandal. And one of the things we were talking about is that 45% of the students at Harvard don't receive any aid whatsoever because they didn't qualify for it. And my assessment was that certainly while probably a big chunk of those families can write a check for $75,000, $80,000 a year and no problem, I would guess that there is also a decent percentage of students who are mortgaging themselves to the hilt and their
Correct.
families to go, and who may be well graduating with a couple $100,000 in debt because it's Harvard. And that is, you better get a really high paying job out of there, or that's going to be debt that follows you around for a long, long time. And that doesn't feel good to have debt
Yeah.
that you feel like what you just said, right? Well, I can't pay more than $10 a month, so therefore I'm just not going to pay anything, right? Like,
Yep.
yikes,
Yeah.
not good.
Yeah, and we're using Harvard in this example, but I could literally replace Harvard with any school name.
Mhm.
If you're over borrowing as a family and you're saying things like, "Oh, let's worry about it later," not really a good plan.
No.
So I think student loan debt is a reality. Paying for college is a reality, but there's ways to do it. Realistically, if the student is borrowing, you really don't want them borrowing more sum total than they could make in their first year.
Yep.
So if, for those families who are listening that are making decisions, might be seniors in high school, think about that. If the student is, not looking at a high paying field or needs to go immediately back to graduate school, borrowing 30, 40, $50,000 a year to cover a balance probably doesn't make sense.
Yep.
So, let's not all hang our hopes on loan forgiveness. Because I think one of the things that's come up a lot in conversations is what happens if it happens now? Is it going to happen again? Are we
Right.
going to eliminate student loans? So let's not count on what could be. Let's plan on what is.
Exactly.
But that's a huge reality.
Yes. That's a very practical way of looking at life that I think you and I share. Not everyone does, but
Yeah,
we're just
exactly.
pleading with those of you who are listening to adopt this.
Yeah,
Stacy,
exactly.
thank you so much for joining today. This was really helpful, and at least for me, from my perspective, given that we have a student at home with loans, really insightful. So I appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're talking about what to expect with these these early decision, early action priority decisions that are going to be coming through really any day now. So don't go away.